Very good evening to all of you for joining us today at this exciting panel that we have lined up today. So I'm very privileged to welcome all of you to today's panel. I'm Professor San Lim. I'm Professor of Communication and Technology at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. And I'm also Head of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. So as a professor of communication, today's topic speaks greatly to me, and I'm sure it will be extremely illuminating for all of us. So just to explain, this is actually the second of a three-part webinar series on gender, security, and digital space, co-organized by the Center of Excellence on National Security at the Rajaratnam School at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, in collaboration with the High Commission of Canada. And today's topic is a really fascinating one because it pertains to issues of online disinformation, but particularly taking a gendered lens. And in my opening remarks today, I want to strike a sort of reflective note as I think about my journey as an academic looking at issues of media literacy. I don't think over 20 years ago, when I started my research on online behavior and looking at issues of digital inequalities, digital skills, digital competencies, I don't think any of us imagined at that time what a phenomenal problem fake news would become. And today it's become a tremendous scourge. And as you can see from many different governments and the responses they've tried to take to all of these different problems brought about by online disinformation, it's become an issue not just of national security, but also of individual safety. And of course, it pertains also to the health of the online space and how much people can benefit from the online environment. So I'm really delighted that we have three really illustrious speakers today to talk about the issue of gendered disinformation and online misogyny and the implications that this will have for women and our use of the internet. And honestly, a safer internet for women is actually a safer internet for everyone. So when we think about the whole business of fake news and the scourge that it has become, I think very often it seems to be that everyone says, oh, media literacy is the solution. We need to make sure that people are much more media literate. And honestly, as a media literacy scholar, I sometimes joke that fake news is the best gift that we've been given because finally people are awakening to the importance of media literacy. And yet, at the same time, I think it is grossly unfair to always push the burden onto the individual user to say, oh, if it's gender, if it's fake news, then, you know, people just need to be more media literate. People just need to be more savvy. People just need to be a little bit more alert and circumspect. And I think it's very unfair to push this humongous burden onto the user because there are so many trends working against us, men and women. There are so many trends working against us as we try to use the internet in a way that's safe and beneficial. But particularly with regard to women, I want to point out that there has, of course, been the whole issue of algorithmic biases that have now crept into how online information is being mined, how online platforms are designed, and how many of these machine learning processes are actually teaching themselves discriminatory practices because of the corrupted data that they are being fed with. And this will have actually very negative implications for all users over time because the bad data or the biased data is actually going to start to entrench itself into a lot of the online digital infrastructures that inform us, that serve us more content, and so on. And at the same time, we also have to think about the emergence of other online cultural trends. So for example, there is the emergence of the bro culture in games, which have introduced a lot of toxicity into how women are represented, into how women are regarded and spoken of. And at the same time, we see also platforms like Instagram and Reddit and so on that generate a lot of memes that very often look at women's issues or talk about women in disparaging tones, but in a way that is humorous. So it actually sort of trivializes or seems to make light of the disparaging comments But in the process, this humor actually serves to normalize such misogyny. And it will eventually shrink the online space for women where we don't feel that sense of safety and security. And fundamentally, it's very important that women have total unencumbered freedom to explore the online world. And I think in the wake of the pandemic of the past year, we've been able to see how women play such an important role in our society, in our households, where women have been bearing the brunt of household duties. In my own research, I have talked to parents, but fundamentally, mothers play a very important role in terms of guiding young children's online use. Mothers play a very important role in terms of curating the online environments, curating the devices in the house. So we play a very critical role in terms of shepherding the next generation's use of the internet. And it is therefore even more critical in light of all of these trends that women should feel completely unencumbered in the online world. And of course, we mustn't forget the fact that with the dawn of Industry 4.0, we actually do need many more women to enter the tech world, to enter the tech space, to be the programmers, to be the designers, to be the people who are coding and who are writing the algorithms, so that we can ensure that our digital infrastructures are fair and representative of the needs of all members of our society. And that's why I didn't hesitate to say yes to this invitation to moderate this very exciting panel, because I feel that it's a very critical issue that I'm very glad that the Center has actually sought to showcase with the support of the High Commission. And so without further ado, I can't wait to hear from our three speakers today. Allow me to introduce all of them first before I invite them to the floor. So first, we have Dr. Gabrielle Bardol, who is the founder and principal of Horizon Democracy Consulting Group. She's also an affiliated researcher with the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. She's worked in over 60 countries worldwide for a variety of UN agencies and international organizations, including the UNDP and UN Women, as well as the International Foundation for Electoral Systems and the Carter Center. She's an advocate for women's political rights, and she has published and taught about online violence against women in politics for nearly a decade. She holds degrees from McGill University, Sciences Po, and Université de Montréal. She received the American Political Science Association's Congressional Fellowship and the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Doctoral Scholarship for her work in the area of violence against women in politics. Next, we have Lucina Dimeko, who is co-founder of She Persisted. Lucina is a gender equality expert and women's rights advocate. She's the author of She Persisted, Women, Politics, and Power in the New Media World, a study investigating the relationship between women in politics and social media in 30 countries. Her work has been featured on Time Magazine, The Washington Post, The Hill, and Voice of America, among others. She's the co-founder of She Persisted Global, an initiative tackling gender disinformation and online attacks against women in politics by enhancing research and understanding of gender disinformation campaigns and connecting a network of women leaders globally and providing them with the tools that they need to respond to online attacks and advance regulatory solutions. And our last speaker for this evening is Nina Jankowicz, who is Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center. Nina studies the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe. She's the author of How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. She has advised the Ukrainian government on strategic communications under the auspices of a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship, and her writing has been published by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and others. So without further ado, allow me to welcome our very first speaker, and that's Dr. Gabrielle Bardol. Gabrielle, please.
Thank you so much. Just a moment, please. All right. Hopefully you can see that all right. So disinformation is a uniquely effective way of weaponizing information and perceptions in order to achieve political ends. It is used worldwide to sideline women from leadership and as a way of maintaining a patriarchal control of the political space. The good news is that there are ways of combating it. So as we've just heard, my name is Gabrielle Bardall. I'm here to explain my research and to offer some paths for solutions to this issue. I will warn you ahead of time, a trigger warning, there are some disturbing content in my slides related to this issue, starting with our first slide here. When women speak up to lead and to dissent in the public space, they regularly face abusive and violent backlash. And more often than not, we know that that backlash is occurring on digital platforms. The example that you see on the screen is a real example from a candidate in California, but this happens worldwide, from Sri Lanka to Zimbabwe to the Ukraine to Chile and beyond. When online vitriol, when online hate, this type of hatred is directed at political women, it builds on broader patterns of gendered exclusion and discrimination and violence. The harms of online abuse and of violence are gendered in significant ways, and this drives women out of political spaces, and it also contributes to maintaining patriarchal political institutions and policies. Now, gender disinformation or misinformation is actually part of a bigger spectrum of what we call violence against women in politics. Now, violence against women in politics is really broad, and it includes everything from murder, political assassination, and political rape to symbolic forms of violence, and even the silencing of women. And there is a general consensus that women often face non-physical and psychological forms of violence more than men do. And this includes threats, harassment, abuse, defamation, sexualization, and other aspects like this. And we also know that violence against women in politics does occur online, but not exclusively. It occurs offline as well, and that these different types are interrelated to each other. And we also know that this type of violence targets women because they are women. It is not simply another part of politics as usual, but it is a specific way of keeping women out of the political space, of maintaining a heteronormative political control. And we see this pattern starting from forms of incivility online, and then including forms of information disorder, so disinformation and misinformation, as we're talking about here today. When that type of information disorder spills over into more intense forms, that's when we start seeing overt hate speech and ultimately direct acts of violence. So the research I'm here to talk to you about today includes social media analysis, including artificial intelligence-based analysis, empirical data gathering, including focus groups and interviews in a number of different countries. From 2018 to 2019, I was working with IFAS on a lot of these things. We did case studies in 7 different countries. Over the past 2 years, I have continued this research with UN Women, with the Council of Europe, and with the Carter Center. These cases, in addition to research from comparative third-party studies from Amnesty International, from National Democratic Institute, and of course from our very own She Persisted, have resulted in case studies from numerous different countries. Now, I am going to offer you an overview of the key findings of that research, and then go on to talk a little bit about why disinformation as a part of the broader family of violence against women in politics is something that we need to pay particular attention to, and how we can define it as its own specific issue. So, some of the key aspects of violence against women in politics online, this online hate against women in political roles. We know that this is a globally pervasive problem. It is everywhere. I have yet to come across a country where it does not exist and it is not a significant barrier to women's political participation. That said, it is culturally specific in each place, and it varies. The content and the nature of that hatred reflects local gendered norms and attitudes around women. So, for example, research in Zimbabwe shows that some of this online hatred might draw on references to witchcraft, for example, because that's a common trope. However, if you go elsewheres, please advance. For example, in the Ukraine, you'll see that it relates back to historical origins of communism and of state threats. So this is, it's a globally pervasive problem, but it does have cultural specificities. Next, we often see that women tend to go viral, as they say. When women go viral, that means that you see these viral moments, these attacks on women spike over time. And that's a reflection of the fact that violence against women in politics online, gender disinformation and misinformation tends to be sensational. It is sensational because it's about women who are breaking norms, and therefore it can have a really major impact in a very short amount of time. Next, we know that women can experience higher intensities of aggression. This is not always the case, but it's very often the case. We see death and rape threats. We see threats against family members, against children. There's a very high intensity to these threats. Next, we see that aggression can be triggered by political events. So it follows the electoral cycle, it follows campaigns and election moments. But it also, women tend to experience higher levels of sustained aggression over time. These impacts, these hateful comments and online attacks can follow a woman for years, even if she drops out of the political space. Next, we know that this type of violence and this type of harm tends to be concentrated out of urban areas. You're seeing examples from 3 different countries where we looked at the data being focused on the urban areas, but it does tend to spread outside of there, and it can change technologies. You know, information on Twitter and other social media can be picked up by radio stations and even by traditional newspapers and spread beyond those borders. And talking about spreading beyond borders, if we continue, we see that online violence is not limited by national borders. It follows diasporas and it follows other global patterns. So this is not something that falls under a single national jurisdiction in terms of its responses. We see that violence against women online varies according to a number of other different factors, including the candidate profile, the electoral system, the quota design. In particular, we know that high-profile women are especially targeted by this, but that it can have chilling effects and kind of come on down the scale to women who might not have that public profile to date. We also know a few things about the impacts and trends in this space. As I just mentioned, this type of violence has a chilling effect, but it can also drive awareness and change. So what I mean by that is that it certainly does achieve its impact of driving women out of the political space through intimidation. But it's also, because it's so publicly visible, you know, it's right in front of you on social media, it's driving more awareness and anger, and which is driving activism and organization around it. So that's significant. And it can also drive women to shift the spaces where they're engaging. Maybe they're not using the overtly public channels as much, but they're moving towards other technologies that are a bit more secure. Going ahead, we know that online violence is not only about women, it also can target men, often with homophobic content, because it is essentially a way of maintaining a heteronormative political space. And that is important to keep in mind. This is about gendering the political space more broadly. Moving ahead, we know that this is also a tool of foreign meddling, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and it's a part of authoritarian influence. This is a broader political strategy, and disinformation in particular is important for that, because disinformation more broadly has been associated with that international impact. We know that violence against women online does not is a part of the conversation about intersectionality, and that it reflects differently on women and men with different marginalizations and different identities. And a major problem going ahead also is that impunity around this problem is really inhibiting our ability to address it, not only because of the international implications of it, the lack of jurisdiction, but because so much of this happens behind a screen of anonymity. So these are some of the global cross-national impacts that we see of this. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the impacts we see about measurement also, but I'm going to move quickly through this part so we can talk more about the distinctness of disinformation. So when we study this type of violence in a comparative comparative angle, we can understand that there are different ways of measuring it and of interpreting it. One of the things that's significant is that we need to measure different types of this violence. This is just one typology you see in front of you. There are others, but we can break it down. We can distinguish between these direct physical threats and other forms of intimidation, harassment, defamation. Some of these things have legal implications, some of them have others, but it is important to break it down in order to adapt our responses appropriately. Continue ahead once more. We also know that it involves different tactics, and we need to stay on top of these at all times. There's an evolving vocabulary around the tools of this that we all need to be aware of when we develop our responses. Some of those have legal impacts, others have social consequences, but all of them are a part. If you're not already familiar with them, I'll do a plug for the Women's Media Center where this slide is drawn from. They have really excellent resources on understanding the different tactics involved here. We also know that cyberspace is multi-dimensional and that individuals can share their content in public and private spaces with different degrees of security and different degrees of control over their content. So moving ahead, understanding that when we're studying this problem and when we're taking responses and initiatives to engage with it, we need to know which part of internet we're engaging with. Is it on Twitter, which is the Wild West and wide open, or are we looking at WhatsApp private messages or private messages on Facebook? All of these aspects of it will help shape the way we respond to this problem more broadly. We can also talk about who is involved here. We can break down the different targets of this and the different perpetrators of it. Please go ahead. We know that the targets of this violence are not only women candidates and women elected officials, but they come from multiple different spheres. They are civil society activists, they are civil servants, they are regular community leaders. We also know that the perpetrators come from different categories as well. Please advance. And further into my research, we can look at it, but people have different degrees of engaging as perpetrators in this type of harm, either directly or through less direct aspects, which I won't go into right here. Please go ahead. The last thing are the metrics of measurement, and you can click through this. There are different types of violence. We know that we can always collect information on the basic frequency, but we also need to be researching the content of this stuff, the volume of it, the speed at which it occurs, and the intensity, how harmful it is. Now, I've got about 2 minutes left, and I'd like to use that time to talk about the notion of disinformation as a part of this broader spectrum, of this broader range of violence against women in politics. Now, we can see clearly that gender disinformation clearly fits within this big spectrum, and it needs to be considered as a part of it. But it's also distinct in its own ways. So what is specific about gender disinformation? There's a few components. So disinformation in general, it's a new term, and there are a lot of different assumptions that are packed into it. First of all, intent. It is about intentionally misleading others by spreading false information. It also assumes that online spaces are the medium for this, but we know that it's not restricted to online spaces. It's disinformation in general, not just gender disinformation, is commonly connected with state actors as the perpetrators, but again, it's not exclusively state actors. It is viewed as a tactical strategy of political subversion. It is a form of espionage in many cases. And it's also something that's commonly associated with foreign meddling. And finally, the objectives of disinformation at large are to influence public opinion or to obscure the truth. So we need to distinguish this from other forms of online violence against women in politics. And we also need to understand when and how state actors are using gender as a hostile tactic of political subversion. These are the key terms. So we want to distinguish this from other forms of violence against women in politics. What is unique about disinformation? So it is commonly said that disinformation amplifies existing bias. that it's a downward spiral. Harmful gender bias and prejudice already exist in societies. And so the purveyors of this are playing on those existing things by spreading false claims about women in politics that are rooted in these types of biases. So people believe rumors that reinforce their bias, and that's what ultimately results in excluding women from political leadership. So just for example, people might believe that women in politics are not strong enough to lead. That's a general bias that might exist in a society. A disinformation campaign can come along and maybe they manipulate a video or doctor a photo to show that a woman leader is crying or is looking soft somehow. That act of disinformation is reinforcing existing prejudice, and it is a way of confirming and contributing ultimately to their lack of support for women leaders. So if we take that approach to understanding gender disinformation, it isn't just about holding a harmful bias or expressing that bias on social media. It's about the actual act. It's about the lie. It's about the rumor. It's about the manipulated image that is used to intentionally and deceptively reinforce that existing harmful bias. So sadly, bias, hate, misogyny, etc., those things are real. They're not fake news. But disinformation is the act of weaponizing that fake news. We need to think of disinformation as a verb and not as a noun. So it's a pretty simple formula. It's not the ultimate solution to the problem, but it is one way of kind of distinguishing what is unique about disinformation and otherwise. Now, I think I am arriving at the end of my time, so I won't go on to more detail. But just to conclude with a couple of remarks, what can we do about this? We need to have long-term strategies accompanied by short-term strategies. We need to work to change the big picture issues, the laws, the social media platforms, the attitudes, the norms. We need to engage with toxic masculinities in the long haul, but we also need to work on short-term resilience strategies, and I'd be happy to talk more about those in the Q&A. Thank you.
I come from a gender equality and women's rights background, and I got interested in gender disinformation a couple of years ago as I did a research on the relationship between women in politics and social media. So as I interviewed over 85 women leaders in 30 countries, there were a few patterns that kept coming up and a few things that I started hearing. I heard that the social media environment is really gendered, full of vile materials, that women were spending an overwhelming amount of time to defend themselves and their reputations, that there was no accountability for the perpetrators of the online abuse, and social media platforms were actually not part of the solution, but very often part of the problem. That these experiences really changed those women's perception of the world, and some of them told me they would never ever run again, and they had actually discouraged other women around them to consider running for office because of the impact that online harms had on their lives. We have been knowing about this problem for a few years now. Since 2016, at least, there have been documented surveys that looked at the incidence of gender disinformation and online harassment against women in politics. Over and over, we keep hearing that women, in fact, are harassed more than men, that very often those attacks are coming from inauthentic actors. And more recently, we're beginning to understand also the gender dimension of these attacks and the gender dimension in particular of the disinformation attacks. So when I talk about gender disinformation as a working definition, I'm thinking of the spread of deceptive or inaccurate information and images, because the visual part is particularly important when it comes to women, against women political leaders, journalists, and female public figures, following storylines that often draw misogyny, as well as gender stereotypes around the role of women. So the gender here has to do with the nature of the attacks that are gendered, with the target of the attacks that are women, and also with the motives. There is very often a motive of this, altering public understanding of females politician track record for immediate political gain. And we're going to see, in fact, who the actors are very often behind those disinformation campaigns. Very often, gender disinformation leads to online abuse and hate. Here we see, for example, a fake story around former Speaker of the House and Congresswoman Laura Boldrini in Italy, she would have been a showgirl in the past, and so this fake news started circulating on Italian media, often linked to images of her, of someone that was supposed to be her in a bikini. It was not her, but this led to an amount of hate against her, rape threats, and together with many other fake stories around her, really made her a very controversial, in many ways, public figure. And she herself told me that today in Italy, threats of rape are used to intimidate women politicians and push them out of the public sphere, and that very often those fake stories actually start from their political opponents. Gender disinformation has also been used to cover and justify politically motivated murders. Here is the story of Marielle Franco, councilwoman from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. She was assassinated in 2018, and there is still not full clarity around her assassination. There is a belief that it might have been, in fact, politically motivated. She was very outspoken on the need of having more Black women in politics and very critical of the president. After her death, fake stories started circulating around her having been married to a drug dealer and maybe therefore having been murdered by a drug dealer. The fact that she was taking drugs herself, that she would have had children when she was very, very young, even a minor, and all those stories were not true, and they were really meant at making the political murder more justifiable in some ways, because they were really questioning her morality. There are some common themes that we see everywhere around gender disinformation, and I could bring up very many more stories. They're around women being liars, being not trustworthy, being too sexual, or not sexy enough, and therefore somehow not being real women, being stupid, being weak. Ultimately, the message is clear: women are not fit for politics. Politics is a dirty game, and those who are not willing to play by the rules of that dirty game shouldn't enter. The goals and the impact of gender disinformation are also pretty common across countries. We see, of course, pushing women out of politics, very often backsliding of women's rights, because women very often are, in fact, the ones that are carrying those rights forward. And there is a broader dimension too of eliminating political opposition, as we heard in those cases of Marielle Franco and Laura Boldrini. And also, we have seen cases of influencing foreign elections through this gender disinformation. And I know that my colleague Nina has done fantastic work on that in particular. Ultimately, gender disinformation erodes democratic institutions and human rights. Women's rights have been defined often as the litmus test for democracy and human rights. And in fact, we know that when they are attacked, democracy and human rights more broadly are at risk. The main actors and the super spreaders, we could say, of gender disinformation are strongman political leaders, illiberal actors, authoritarian leaders, and they are taking advantage of a conglomerate of misogynist websites and blogs that are often referred to as the manosphere, that really amplify this type of fake and outrageous content, thanks to an enabling environment where social media platforms' algorithmic preferences really reward and artificially amplify very often that content, because it does generate profit for them in the form of greater engagement. There are things that have been tried and to some extent have been successful in really pushing back against this type of attacks. Last year, Ultraviolet, together with a coalition of women's organizations, including She Persisted, put together a fairness guide for reporting on gender disinformation without replicating it. And so shared it with journalists, really in the understanding that what had happened before was that very often in an attempt to denounce gender disinformation, fake stories would be replicated and become ever more pervasive. There have been some efforts from the US Congress to start holding platforms accountable. In July 2020, Representative Jackie Speer authored a letter to Facebook co-signed by 100 women parliamentarians and congresswomen from 30 countries, specifically calling out the artificial amplification that happens on Facebook because of algorithmic preferences that reward extreme and dangerous points of view. And so there was a first really attempt at addressing the responsibility of social media platforms and doing that in a really cross-national manner, directly calling out Facebook in particular and social media companies more in general. Women in politics have also been more and more outspoken around the attacks that they are receiving. So on International Women's Day this year, we saw a really fantastic video from First Lady of Namibia, Monica Gengos, talking about the online attacks that she had received, the amount of violence and also fake and absurd stories around her, and how she had been over and over told actually not to respond, to let it go. And this letting go had actually made things worse. And so she called out to all women to actually not ignore this type of attacks, but in fact call them out, and the fact that silence does not protect women, silence only protects perpetrators. And we are beginning to see that really this type of outspokenness is actually paying off for more and more women in politics. And I want to share here the case of Mamata Banerjee. Mamata Banerjee is West Bengal chief minister, and starting 2020, she actually became very openly target of a series of disinformation campaigns with all kinds of fake stories around her and her party. And very often those stories were also gendered in nature and played out on this idea that women are untrustworthy. And more and more her party began to recognize that there was really a coordinated effort, a politically motivated effort around those campaigns and those attacks. In August 2020, her party sent even a letter to Mark Zuckerberg complaining that hundreds of accounts from their supporters had been removed and pointing to the link to the ruling party in India. In April of this year, The Guardian came out with a story that in fact Facebook had planned to remove a number of fake accounts in India until there was a realization that the ruling party was involved, and then they stopped. This year, in this year's election, happened just this month, misogyny has been again called out on the campaign trail. Mamata was target of misogynist attacks that referred to her, catcalled her from political leaders, and also started all kinds of, all kinds of discussions on social media. She had a broken leg, and therefore one foot was visible, and politicians, opposing politicians started to say that in fact she was trying to show her legs and things like that. She was very outspoken, journalists were outspoken, civil society was outspoken in calling out the sexism in the campaign. And this year, actually she won with a dominating victory for herself and her party, something that was quite unprecedented, with a very large amount and percentage of the women's vote. And many women, in fact, reported voting for her is exactly as a result of the misogyny they had seen on the campaign trail and they thought was unacceptable. So what do we need next to have more such stories? She Persisted is working on a three-pronged strategy, and that's where we think that, really the need is, on the one hand, we need to better understand gender disinformation efforts, and in particular, we need to understand them in the global south as they relate to authoritarianism, because this is really an area that is very unexplored and where we have relatively little data, particularly on the quantitative side. We need to support the women leaders fighting disinformation and trying to push for regulatory change, and therefore actually becoming greater targets of disinformation in their countries. They need to be provided with the tools, the language that they need to really, be on the offense, and take some of the examples from Monica Gengus and Mamata, as we have seen here. And then finally, we need to really influence digital platform standards to ensure that those standards proactively address gendered harms. We are in the situation we are because social media products have been mostly designed by men that were entirely unaware of the type of harms that women face in every day in their lives. And we need to make sure that the policies and the standards that are designed to address online harms do not fall into the same problems, are not designed again by men that are entirely unaware of what's going on for women online. And therefore, we really must make sure that women are at the forefront of those negotiations and those conversations on digital platform standards. So thank you.
So I'm going to go through a research project that we just released at the beginning of the year at the Wilson Center, which is one of the broadest and most detailed studies on gender disinformation in the US context that has taken place so far. And the objectives of our research were to define, quantify, and evaluate the use of online gendered and sexualized disinformation campaigns against women in public life. So we looked at a number of politicians, but we also looked at some journalists who have been targeted by state-sponsored disinformation. And we wanted to use this data to inform policy responses by governments, social media platforms, and employers. As I said, it was a very broad study. So a lot of studies in this space, because of the ease of getting data from Twitter, which has an open API, focus on Twitter. But we know that some of the worst abuse is on platforms like 4chan, 8kun, Parler, Gab, and even Reddit. We found some very misogynistic threads on Reddit. Unfortunately, we couldn't get data from Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. It's quite difficult to scrape data from those platforms, but we did use the CrowdTangle social listening platform to inform the keywords that we were using to go through these other platforms. So essentially looking for themes, nicknames, etc., on Facebook and Instagram, which we saw across the internet. And again, we did a collection based on these bespoke misogynistic keywords, slurs, etc. And these were tailored to include specific keywords that reflected individualized abuse that the subjects of the abuse were receiving. The collection period was just ahead of the US election, so September 1st through November 9th of 2020. And we gathered 338,000 pieces of gendered disinformation and abuse. Again, we were looking at 13 subjects, so 10 US politicians, and we threw in some international English-speaking politicians from New Zealand, Canada, and the UK, just as a little bit of a comparative exercise. And these candidates were chosen to reflect diversity in political affiliation, race, ethnicity, and levels of visibility. But I would stress that we view this very much as still just a pilot project. While it was a longer duration and a wider sample than many other projects, we weren't able to gather the amount of data that we would have liked to about all women candidates. And so there's still plenty of work to be done in this sphere. And as you can see from the graph on the right, Twitter still made up most of the data that we gathered. There are a lot more users on Twitter. The conversation about politics in the United States mostly happens on Twitter. And one of our hypotheses is there's more abuse on Twitter because perpetrators of abuse, abusers, prefer to yell at their targets rather than just about them. And most female candidates for office don't have, 8kun accounts, for instance, or Parler accounts. How do we define gendered abuse and disinformation? It's a little bit different than how some of our other speakers today have defined it. So I just want to put that out there, that how we're defining it. Gendered abuse is the often casual use of derogatory terms aimed at degrading or insulting women based on their gender, ranging from name calling to sexually violent threats. And a subset of that, as we see it, is gendered and sexualized disinformation. And that has three components. One is its veracity. It is clearly false. Two is the coordination involved. We often see dogpiling or other deliberate campaigns against women to discredit them, so some degree of coordination. And three, its aim is to deter women from participating in the public sphere. So those are the three components: falsity, coordination, and the goal of the gendered and sexualized disinformation. Slightly different than other political disinformation that we might see. And we also coined this term malign creativity. This is one of the biggest problems, the biggest challenges to identifying gendered disinformation and abuse online. And one of the reasons that although I don't sympathize or support the platforms and their lack of political will in addressing gendered disinformation, one of the reasons their job is so difficult. So malign creativity is the use of coded language, iterative or context-based visual and textual memes, and other tactics to avoid detection. So an example, and I apologize for my use of this word, but rather than calling a woman candidate a bitch, spelled B-I-T-C-H, you might see B!TCH. And that helps abusers avoid detection because the platforms have a set of classifiers that attempt to look for words like bitch and other words that are similar. And so we actually found a lot of these nicknames and the use of coded language that were iterative after platforms caught on to certain nicknames and other narratives. And frankly, the platforms don't have the situational, cultural, or sometimes even linguistic knowledge to detect this stuff. And that's one of the main challenges and why we titled our report Malign Creativity. What's the difference, again, in our data between gendered abuse and disinformation? In keyword frequency, we saw gendered abuse more often than gendered disinformation. However, most of the targets that we studied were affected by gendered disinformation. And in fact, the ones that we didn't see affected were often older women. This is another hypothesis that we hope someone is going to test in future research. But almost all of our candidates were affected by gendered abuse. And most of them were affected by gendered disinformation. It is a widespread phenomenon. The overarching narratives that we found were sexual, transphobic, and racist and racialized narratives. And it looks like a small percentage of the total data, but this is just among the gendered disinformation that we found in our abusive data set. And I'll just go through a couple of the examples. This is obviously a word cloud that is created based on the frequency of the terms. Many of the narratives that we saw that were sexualized were directed toward Vice President Kamala Harris, then candidate Kamala Harris, about 78% of the data, as a matter of fact. And here you can see some examples of malign creativity among the nicknames that she was given, because these aren't going to be, floated in the regular mainstream media. You have to know to look for them. And many of the platforms, frankly, did not know. We also saw a lot of transphobic disinformation narratives. So they were making the case that these successful women could not possibly have been so successful unless they were transgender. There's some homophobia baked into that. There's also, frankly, the idea of the duplicitous woman that is baked into that narrative. And we saw this affecting many of the highest ranking women in our data set, including Kamala Harris and New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. And we also saw racist and racialized disinformation narratives. A lot of those were targeted to Ilhan Omar, the representative from Minnesota here in the United States. And let me just tell you the difference, if you're not familiar, between racist and racialized narratives. Obviously, racist narratives target someone on the basis of their race or ethnicity, but racialized narratives refer to the bottom green bar that you see, as well as the Kamala Ain't Black hashtag, which say that the subjects of these narratives actually aren't the race that they claim to be, that is part of their major identity. So Sandy Cortez refers to a nickname that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had when she was in college, and saying that she's actually not a woman of color. Same idea for Kamala Harris, saying that she isn't Black because of her ethnicity. And so trying to twist that important part of their identity against these women. There was also I would say, a convergence of narratives against Representative Ilhan Omar, not just calling her a supporter of terrorism, but saying that because she is a Somali American, that she may have married her brother. So an element of sexualization in that as well. There are a lot of challenges, as I mentioned before, to detecting and taking down this abuse against women that we see on platforms. Malign creativity is the greatest one that we see, but platforms really lack the tools. And I believe this is because of a lack of political will on their part to solve these problems. They don't have adequate definitions of harassment. We had a lot of our focus group participants tell us, I've received direct rape threats and nothing was done about them. They said, you know, this isn't a threat, this isn't targeted harassment. Well, if that is not targeted harassment, then what is, right? As Lucina said, these platforms they're not structured in a way that is supportive to women. They were built by and for cisgendered white men. There's also a lack of intersectionality in enforcement. So as I was talking about before, there's a lot of convergence between these narratives. They don't always fit under specific buckets as you report in the reporting process. That is really problematic. And then obviously a lot more challenges here, including that women of color face far greater threats than their white counterparts. But the biggest thing that's a problem for me as someone who has gone through this stuff is that the onus of reporting is on targets. We are meant to do the work for these multi-billion-dollar companies rather than them having a duty of care toward their users. When I am in the midst of receiving abuse, I have to go through and report one by one each piece of content that is targeted toward me. And then after that, I have to take screenshots of all of it so that I have it in case something is going to escalate and I want to report it to law enforcement. And nowhere in that entire process do I have any personal outreach from companies who are supposed to be enforcing their terms of service in order to protect me and make the online experience for women and others like me more equitable. In fact, I get automated emails, sometimes not even that, in response to this mountain of abuse that I have to climb. We do have policy recommendations that I think would really improve how platforms are dealing with this. And the biggest one, again, from my personal experience and something that we heard from our focus group participants who are women in the public eye across sectors from journalism, academia, tech, we would like to see the introduction of incident reports rather than doing reporting as a user on an ad hoc basis by a content by content report, especially in incidents of dogpiling, when you are receiving mountains of abuse that have been targeted at you that come from one specific account. One high follower account will essentially sick his followers onto you. An incident report would add a lot of context for the content moderator on the other side, who can say, okay, this is a pattern of abuse coming from this one specific account. Here's what we can do to help you. Here's how we can tweak your mentions. Here's how we can help you categorize and frankly, archive much of the abuse in case you want to press charges in an environment where that's something that is potentially doable. And that's not every legal environment, unfortunately. We're also encouraging platforms to regularly update their AI classifiers so that they can root out malign creativity, ideally with active participation from targets themselves. So if we see women in politics who are being targeted, working with their campaigns and their staff to identify those nicknames that frankly, the content moderators and policymakers at platforms probably don't know about. They should know, but may not. Updating definitions of targeted harassment, as I mentioned, extremely important. Creating and enforcing meaningful consequences for persistent abusers. Sometimes these guys just delete the content and then go on to abuse other women. I would like to see a definitive 3 strikes policy where if you've done this once, you get your account turned off for a couple of days. Twice, you do it for a week, and there's a warning that says your account might be deleted. And then 3 times, banning these folks. Thank you. Introducing nudges or friction is incredibly important, and we've seen Twitter do this recently, where they're going to notify you if they detect mean words in your tweet. This has actually worked on a couple of anti-bullying measures that Instagram and I believe TikTok have taken, so I'd love to see it introduced in the gender dimension as well. Lawmakers have a huge role to play, as well as policymakers at the national level. When you are thinking about your social media regulation bills, one of the things that we think is incredibly important is introducing transparency for reporting measures against these platforms. So we know how many reports were filed, what action was taken, and in particular, what action was taken in regards to abuse of women and other marginalized communities on the platforms. I would also love to see censoring of members who use gendered attacks. We are seeing this increasingly here in the United States. As Gabrielle pointed out, it's something that happens all around the world. And I think parliamentarians owe it to their colleagues to maintain that decorum, not just on the floor of Parliament, but also in their official business, in their campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. They set a standard for how we talk about and to women in all of our countries, and we need to hold them to that standard and censure them when they cross that line. And then we're also trying to raise awareness that employers have a role to play here. In industries, frankly, where, you might not think you have a role to play. So for the forthcoming book on this topic that CENS is putting together, I'll be putting out a rubric of how to protect women in national security who are on the receiving end of this abuse. And frankly, employers don't think about this enough. How can you support the women who are public facing in your organizations when they are going through this abuse? Can you pay for anti-doxing services? Can you issue a statement? Can you interface on their behalf with social media platforms so as to remove some of the pressure that they are feeling when all of this is going on? It's incredibly important for employers to be part of that support network. And then just to leave you with a final thought, what are the impacts of gendered and sexualized disinformation and abuse? In the short term, as both Gabrielle and Lucina pointed out, women are disengaging from public life. One of our focus group participants said that oftentimes her solution is to lock down her account or completely go offline and not post for a few days. And this is a woman who is a leader in her field. She said she doesn't feel safe to continue speaking, so she doesn't speak. She is self-censoring because of the abuse that she receives. And in the long term, the repercussions on women's participation in democracy and our equal representation in elected offices we can't understate that. When young women, when women who are considering running for office or engaging for public life, see the type of abuse that women like Kamala Harris, for instance, are enduring, women who are at the top of their fields, they're going to consider whether or not they want to engage at all. And as both Gabrielle and Lucina pointed out, the prevalence and effectiveness of these narratives, which is held up and amplified by social media, is a fissure in our society that malign actors can and do exploit. So this is not just a women's issue. It is a national security issue, and it's important that we think of it as such. And that is it for me today. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.